This is lecture 24. This is the last in our consideration of the theme, Life in its Past. Now, if you've been following these lectures from the beginning, you no doubt realize that religion has had a lot to do with the history of Western science. Scholars have, of course, taken notice of this for some time. The idea that God created the world and imposed laws on it that it's our job to discover has been a central motivation to Western science from very early on. It was explicit in the minds of the makers of the scientific revolution of the 17th century. They were convinced that they were bringing greater glory to the God that they believed in by seeking to find laws that had been used in creating the natural world. And that attitude certainly continued on into the 18th and 19th centuries in the minds of most natural philosophers. Now, whether or not scientists of the 21st century think of their pursuit of new natural laws in religious terms or not, the origin of this endeavor certainly emerged from distinctly religious heritages here in the West. In Eastern cultures, for example, the incentive to find order and regularity in nature may be due more to an aesthetic motive. The goal is to appreciate nature's beauty, not necessarily to uncover laws that have been imposed onto nature from outside. But in the West, we tend to assume that there are laws to be discovered. As Einstein said, God may have been stubborn in making the laws difficult for us to find, but God would never make a universe that couldn't be understood because nature is at bottom irrational. At present, when we ask why nature has to be rational, why there has to be natural law at all, some have grown uncomfortable at giving a religious answer to that question. But in the era when modern natural science was born, natural philosophers did not hesitate to justify their answer in religious terms. We've also observed, over the 2 centuries we've been exploring, that the religious orientation of natural philosophers produced a changing conception of the relationship of God to nature. Because they believed God had imposed laws onto nature, they began to assume that God had used these laws in his creation of the natural world. And that raised the question of how God had used them. That is, what the natural means were that God had employed in making the world what it is today. This whole enterprise led to a new attitude about God for some. Certain natural philosophers began to allow the intimate relationship that had always existed between God and nature to change. In the traditional attitude, God ruled over nature directly. God spoke and things happened immediately as a result. Here, God was regarded as the loving superintendent of nature whose direct and continuous involvement was necessary for natural processes to work at all. But some began to assume that God's perfection meant that he had created a world that was also perfect, at least in the sense that it followed laws that guaranteed nothing would happen in nature that was not intended from the beginning. We've watched over the 2 centuries covered in this course how this attitude grew and how it challenged the older, more traditional view of God's intimate relationship to the cosmos. By the time we got to the middle of the 19th century, this new attitude, which we identified with the word deism, was very visible in the public sphere, even though it certainly was still far from the majority view. When Darwin's theory reopened the issue of evolution in 1859, it did so with a vengeance. As I mentioned in Lecture 20, Darwin's idea of natural selection, if rigorously applied, didn't require any sort of divine blueprint for evolution like all the pre-Darwinian versions of evolution had. All you had to have were variations from which those best adapted to the environment would be selected. Where those variations came from was unimportant for the working of natural selection. If they'd been put there by God, the theory worked fine. But it also worked just as well if the variations had appeared randomly. As the respected 19th century astronomer and philosopher of science John Herschel put it, Darwin's natural selection substituted the law of higgledy-piggledy for divine superintendence of nature. So an intriguing implication of Darwin's idea, especially given the various ways it was understood, was that it forced the issue of God's relation to nature even more than deism had. In this lecture, we're going to inquire about how this question of God's relationship to nature stood in the second half of the 19th century among the religious thinkers of the day. We'll take our cue from the controversy over evolution, especially as it was affected by the appearance of Darwin's Origin of Species, but we're going to want to keep our eye on the broader question of the general relationship between natural science and religion. I'm going to identify 3 different kinds of theologians and ask the question about how they understood Darwin, and then reflect on what their view implied about the larger question of science and religion. We'll see that conservative theologians, by and large, understood Darwin's message clearly, but just didn't agree with it. More liberal theologians, on the other hand, tended not to distinguish Darwinian evolution from older evolutionary ideas, and this allowed them to reconcile evolution with their religious beliefs. The third group of religious thinkers I'll talk about were more radical than either of the first two. They changed the ground rules by challenging the ability of natural science to affect genuine religious belief. Incidentally, I still recognize in the 21st century all 3 of these 19th century attitudes that we're about to meet. In order to tell you about these 3 different kinds of theologians, a preliminary consideration is necessary. You see, I've identified these theologians according to what they thought about the nature of truth. How you understood what truth in fact is conditions the kind of answer you'll accept to the question of God's relationship to nature. So let me say a word or two about this question of truth and how it had come down to the 19th century. You might want to ask yourself how you feel about these options as we consider them. In the classical understanding of truth, which was still widely assumed in the 19th century, the task was to establish a correspondence between the way things are and our ideas about them. This is a very old conception of truth. In fact, it originated with Plato and the Greeks. Plato felt that the physical world had been born from the mind of God, so obviously it must bear the imprint of the divine mind. For the Greeks of Plato's day, an identifying quality of mind was rationality. So the physical world, having its origin in the mind of God, had to be rational. This meant, of course, that the physical world could be explained rationally, if we're clever enough. If we use our rational abilities correctly to formulate the right ideas about the world, we can describe it accurately, just as it really is. This approach then involves a metaphysical claim that nature is rational. This conception has been called the correspondence theory of truth. So here, the truth of a proposition consists in its correspondence between our idea of reality and reality itself. That's because an idea is true if it corresponds with the way nature really is. And this understanding of truth was embraced by most theologians and natural scientists of the 19th century. In natural science, the correspondence theory of truth was, and incidentally remains, a kind of automatic assumption. Let me explain why. By the 19th century, natural science had come to rely heavily on experience. I mean that the role of experience had assumed a place of priority where gaining knowledge about nature was concerned. You first experienced the world, then you formulated ideas about it based on experience, and finally you refined your ideas through further experiment and experience. You did this until there was a correspondence between the idea you'd been refining about nature and the way nature really was. That's still pretty much the way many scientists operate. Now, there's an important implication of coming at things this way that I need to mention because it bears on the relationship between science and religion, and it's this. Since truth consists in getting it right, there can only be one truth. That's not to say that the one truth will be simple. It may, in fact, be very complicated, but there can only be one truth. Okay, so how does this relate to religion? Well, because there's only one truth, there can't be a contradiction between religious truth and scientific truth. There can't be one truth for Monday through Friday and another one for the holy day of the week. What's true for the scientist has to be true for the theologian, and vice versa. So in the correspondence understanding of truth, theologians and scientists have a common cause. Of course, they might disagree about who had been successful in acquiring truth. They could agree about what truth was, a correspondence between our ideas of nature and the way nature is, without necessarily agreeing on who had correctly articulated the idea that most closely corresponded to nature's reality. Once again, this classical conception of truth, the correspondence theory, was very widespread in the 19th century among both scientists and theologians. But that's not to say that it was the only conception of truth available in the 19th century. At the end of the 18th century, a new conception of truth emerged in the aftermath of Kant's achievement, the coherence theory of truth. And this theory of truth was revived among Kantian theologians at the end of the 19th century. So what was this new conception of truth? As we learned back in Lecture 14, Immanuel Kant argued that our minds affect the ideas we have about nature. We condition what we know. Kant therefore regarded the acquisition of classical metaphysical truth as impossible. If our minds affect the ideas we have about nature, then we aren't talking about nature in itself, as it is, apart from our ideas of it. He didn't think you could ever determine how nature really was in itself. And that meant that he rejected the correspondence theory of truth. Why? Well, if you can't ever find out the way nature really is, then there isn't any possibility of comparing the way it really is with our ideas to see if they correspond. For Kant, we can't get outside our minds, so we can't compare our ideas about nature to nature itself to see if they correspond. In this approach, truth clearly can't consist of such a correspondence. The best we can do, according to Kant, is to demand that our experience and our ideas about the world cohere together. We have to give up the notion that we can describe the world like it really is, and we have to be content with descriptions that are at least consistent with each other without demanding that they be true in the classical sense. Truth consists in coherence, not correspondence. In the coherence theory, the truth of a proposition consists not in its correspondence with a reality independent of what may be believed about it, but in its coherence with an existing set of beliefs. Because our minds affect the knowledge we have of the world, the coherence theory of truth doesn't make the metaphysical claim that there's only one truth. Our knowledge of the world is merely useful. It doesn't confirm nature's final rationality. So, these were the two most prominent understandings of truth that were available to thinkers of the 19th century. There would be new ways of understanding truth that would appear after the turn of the 20th century, but they don't play a role here in our story. So what we have so far are two different conceptions of truth, correspondence and coherence, and three kinds of theologian, conservative, liberal, and radical. What we want to do now is to see how each of these three kinds of theologians stood on the question of truth and what bearing that had on their understanding of the relationship between science and religion. Let's take the conservative theologians first. Not surprisingly, they assumed the correspondence theory of truth. They believed that there was only one truth. And of course, they certainly didn't think Darwin had correctly depicted the truth where the history of life, and especially of humankind, were concerned. But conservative theologians displayed a remarkably clear understanding of Darwin's theory. It was because they understood it so well that they rejected it. But in so doing, conservative theologians weren't always a completely united front. They showed some variation in their responses to Darwin and evolution. Let me explain. First, we need to be clear about what made a theologian conservative. I'm identifying as conservative those theologians who wanted to stay as close to a straightforward interpretation of the Bible as possible. Here's where the variation among conservatives showed itself because they carried this out differently. For example, those who held to a strict interpretation of the Bible simply said that the Bible had declared what the truth about animal and human origins was. God had created the world and its inhabitants in 6 days, rested on the seventh, even if you allowed that the word day might not mean 24 hours, but a period of time, still the total amount of time was not great. So clearly, Darwin and other evolutionary thinkers who demanded that the creation of organic diversity had taken eons of time were wrong. Now, it's important to realize that these conservative theologians, an example is the American Charles Hodge at Princeton, these conservative theologians had read Darwin's book and understood his emphasis on natural selection. Hodge, for example, simply couldn't accept that new species arose because of random variations that nature selected. If nature operated on randomly produced variations, then the variations had not been intentionally produced. And that meant that Darwinian evolution was not going anywhere in particular. It was not being superintended. Hodge rendered his verdict about Darwinism in his book of 1874 called What is Darwinism? You didn't have to go too far before the judgment came through loud and clear. Darwinism was atheism. Well, not all conservatives were as harsh as Hodge. Some even acknowledged that evolution had occurred. But they still insisted on the central importance of the Bible and God's role in directing evolution. The American Baptist theologian A.H. Strong is a good example here. He drew on the miracle in the New Testament in which Jesus had turned water into wine at a wedding feast in Canaan. And here's what he wrote. The wine in the miracle of Canaan was no less wine because it had once been water. Likewise, he said, humans were no less human because they once had been brutes. Strong insisted that evolution was God's way of producing humans. Because God was in complete control of history, God could interfere with it at any time to accomplish divine ends. Except for this concession about evolution, which seemed to point him at least a little bit in the direction of deism, Strong's theology was very conservative. Strong himself was no deist. He composed an elaborate book on systematic theology that revolved around establishing correct doctrine based on a proper interpretation of Scripture. Well, other evangelicals, especially in America, also felt they could embrace evolution without relinquishing their religious faith. And some even felt that they could accept natural selection. This may appear surprising to you. How could they accept natural selection and continue to call themselves conservative Christians? Of course, the important thing here is that they did it. Whether or not we think it reasonable is less important than understanding how they could think the way they did. To do it, to accept natural selection and continue to believe God was in control, they emphasized the word selection. A process that selected, they argued, must not be blind, so therefore it could be compatible with divine intent. But later in the 20th century, American evangelicals began to insist more on a literal interpretation of Scripture. And when that happened, as we know from the Scopes trial, the older tolerance for evolution by some evangelicals evaporated. Well, let's turn our attention to theologians who considered themselves more liberal than evangelicals. They had something in common with evangelicals. They shared with them a belief in the correspondence theory of truth. They too believed that there was but one truth to be known and that human reason, when properly used, could arrive at that truth. But they didn't defer so much to the Bible as the articulation of the one truth that they sought. Where nature was concerned, they acknowledged that natural philosophers had uncovered truths that had to be accepted, even when these truths conflicted with the reading of the Scriptures. For example, they believed that evolution had shown that the earth was very old and that life had evolved from primitive beginnings, including human life. Because they believed that science had shown evolution to be true, they argued that religious doctrine had to change. It had to reflect the new truth. These theologians did not hesitate to abandon literal interpretations of the Bible. Now, so far, they seem to resemble the conservative theologian I just mentioned, A.H. Strong. He also said you had to accept evolution. But that's where the resemblance ended. Strong had great respect for the Bible, but many of these liberal theologians, especially on the continent, accepted the so-called higher criticism of the Bible. The higher critics regarded the Bible as literature, subject to study, like other literature. And liberal theologians frequently relinquished belief in miracles, preferring to regard nature as a machinery that ran according to the natural laws of science. Their religious position amounted to deism, God controlling the destiny of nature through the history, controlling laws of nature and history through the laws that God had created and imposed on the world. So liberal theologians retained a belief that God was in control of nature and of history, even if God was remote. For all that, I have to say that by and large, these theologians didn't view evolution as Darwin did, as a process governed primarily by natural selection. But that didn't stop many of them from endorsing Darwin. They didn't grasp natural selection as clearly as some of the conservatives had. They saw evolution as something directed by God, not by random variations selected by nature. They didn't bother themselves with the technicalities of evolution by natural selection, so they often invoked Darwin's name in support of their purposeful conception of evolution. This is a good example of what I said in an earlier lecture about Darwin having had great success in promoting the idea of evolution, but really failing in establishing his account of the means, natural selection, by which evolution had occurred. Now, these theologians saw themselves to be up on things. They thought they were caught up with modern science. And in the encounter between religious and scientific visions of the world, they felt that religion had to give way before scientific truth. And a major part of that new scientific truth was the reality of evolution. Some, like Leslie Stephen in England, even felt that religion itself had to change because it too was subject to the law of evolutionary development. Religion had to evolve to a higher level than it had achieved in the past. So what do we have thus far? We have conservative and liberal theologians, both of whom accepted the correspondence theory of truth, arguing about who had the one truth that they, along with the scientists, were seeking. Conservatives tended to defer to the Scripture on all questions of truth. That meant that when natural science came to obviously different conclusions from the Bible, science had to be opposed. They believed it was crucial to defend God's immediate superintendence of nature and history. Liberals didn't feel as tied to the Bible. Certainly they didn't interpret it literally. They felt that scientists had indeed discovered new truths that religion had to accommodate by incorporating them. Nor did they feel that God's direct and immediate superintendence of nature and history was essential. As long as God was in control of things, which he was in their deistic vision, they felt that the results of natural science could be accepted without threatening religion. Well, there's one more group of theologians I want to consider today. They didn't fit under either the conservative or liberal banner. And the biggest reason why they didn't was because they didn't accept the correspondence theory of truth. Because of this, I've called them radical theologians. They operated on a coherence conception of truth, so they didn't agree that there was but one truth to be had, nor did they feel that religion and science had to be reconciled. Let's learn a little bit more about these theologians, who by and large were located on the continent. The Kantian theologian Wilhelm Hermann is the best example of this position. He announced in a book of 1876 that theologians shouldn't try to acquire the one metaphysical truth about the world since it wasn't attainable. So that kind of an aspiration shouldn't be part of the theologian's task. And yet, he said, theologians had traditionally insisted that sound doctrine should include propositions about nature's constitution, be it geocentric or heliocentric, or about whether nature had developed, and if so, how nature had developed. But Hermann felt, on the contrary, that you couldn't ever achieve the one truth about the world. It wasn't attainable. In fact, theologians shouldn't even participate in the business of trying to describe nature's truth. That only diverted them from the central concern of religion and theology. Theologians had other things to do that were more important to their task. Religion, he said, should concern itself with ethics and morality and living an authentic life. In grappling with these things, what you believed about this scientific theory or that was unimportant. Far more crucial was what you made of your life. In fact, Hermann could sound very conservative, since he believed a personal encounter with Christ resulted in authentic living. In a later book, Hermann discussed our knowledge of the world and its significance. Pursuit of knowledge of nature, he said, should be left to the natural scientist, and religion should not place constraints or restraints on science. You can see that he believed that science and religion should be kept strictly separated. They didn't overlap. Each should be free to pursue its own agenda without interference from the other. Now, his underscoring of the freedom of science was, of course, very welcome from scientists in the late 19th century. But Hermann's position was two-edged. Why? Because, according to Hermann, scientists also should realize that they, too, can't attain metaphysical knowledge of nature. Remember, for the Kantian Hermann, the best we can achieve in our knowledge of the world was a coherent account. That, of course, didn't imply permanence. Another coherent account of the world might emerge at any time that proved preferable. Since there was not one single truth, there was no final scientific truth either. The common search for truth that linked theologians and natural scientists to each other under the correspondence theory was not there for Hermann. But if scientists were not seeking the truth of nature, what then were they doing, according to Hermann? Well, natural science for Hermann was simply the mastering of the world. But that didn't provide an ultimate or final understanding of nature. It was as if Hermann were saying that in our attempts to gain knowledge of nature, there really is only engineering. We're constructing explanations of nature that help us manipulate it for our purposes. Consequently, what those purposes were was of great importance and of interest to Hermann as a theologian. That was because the purposes humans erect have moral and ethical implications, and morality was the purview of religion. So the theologians should be vitally interested in what ends we put scientific theory to, but they shouldn't in any way dictate to scientists what that theory should be. Well, this radical separation of science from religion of the Hermann tradition carried over into the succeeding era. In fact, it became a mark of the existential theology of the early 20th century. But that, of course, takes us beyond the 19th. As the 19th century drew to a close, there was therefore a variety of positions available on the question of God's relationship to nature. And we've uncovered some fascinating implications of this question by dividing religious thinkers up according to their understanding of the nature of truth. What I've called the radical position, which was based on the coherence conception of truth, was the hardest position to maintain. It presented the greatest challenge to most theologians since they were used to speaking about God and nature together, God as creator and sustainer of the world. It was hard for them to accept that such talk was not important to religion, since religion was concerned only with authentic living. And it was equally hard for many natural scientists. Traditionally, scientists were motivated to find nature's truth, but the radical theologians were saying they should give that goal up and concentrate simply on a coherent account of nature that was useful to us. Certainly, the majority of natural scientists of the late 19th century couldn't embrace a vision of science like that. And even with the remarkable developments of 20th century natural science, it remains too hard a choice for many in the 21st century as well. Well, I find it interesting to note in all this that natural scientists and theologians who embrace a correspondence theory, even though they might disagree about who has best articulated the one truth that they both seek, at least share in common a conviction about what the goal is. And that means that there is common ground for discussion and debate. And that's the way it was in the late 19th century as well. We've seen already that there were numerous possible positions available. Admittedly, there were extremists from both natural scientists and theologians. 1874 saw two uncompromising books from each side. John Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science from a scientist, and Charles Hodge's What is Darwinism from a theologian. Unfortunately, works like these have been emphasized too greatly. They have been held up as stereotypic of the choices of the age, but that's because many today regard the issue in such stark and uncompromising terms. The frequent portrait of the post-Darwinian era as a time preoccupied with a pitched battle between science and religion has really been overdrawn. That portrait applies to America in the 1920s, but it doesn't fit other times and places very well. In the great majority of cases, as we've seen today, there have been serious attempts to engage science and religion without presuming at the start that they are mortal enemies. In our next lecture, we begin a series of examinations of physical science and culture in the 19th century. Although we'll focus there on some fascinating ideas from physics, chemistry, and astronomy, not surprisingly, questions of ultimate meaning and of humankind's place in the cosmos will continue never to be far away.